working folk don't have a chance unless we
organise. Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
Tell me
Which side are you on?
Professor Bill Mitchell has been Director of the Centre of Full Employment and Equity at Newcastle University for the past 17 years. He's one of the founders of Modern Monetary Theory, and his blog, Billy Blog, has a wide following. His most recent book is Eurozone Dystopia, Groupthink and Denial on a Grand Scale. Please welcome, I should say that Bill actually not only came down from Newcastle to be here as Victor, but went for a run along Narrowneck this morning for 15 kilometres, so I think he's warmed up.
Well, thanks very much, Nick. This is my lectern here. And being an economist, I would normally be wearing a tie when I did a formal presentation like this. But I thought that, here we go. I thought that given this is a very important weekend in Europe, where all the Greeks should be voting Oxy, and that Alexis Tsipras has been pissing off the Eurogroup by not wearing a tie, and my former colleague Yanis, the finance minister, has been pissing off the Eurofin group by not wearing a tie. I sort of took the risk. I'm sort of out there in my comfort zone. Now, for those who read my blog, I normally have a bit of fun at the weekends. It's really an excuse not to do any work on it, and I have a little quiz. So I thought that we'd start off today with a little quiz, and 2 questions, and you've got to put your hands up, yes or no, and I'll humiliate people who don't participate, of course. How many of you think that by paying taxes to the federal government, you're providing them with funds that they can then spend on social policy and economic policy? So when the government, the other way of asking the question is when the government says we're spending taxpayer funds, how many people think that that's correct? Same people will be putting their hands up, thank you. I haven't got mine up. How many people think that when the Australian Office of Financial Management, which is a division of Treasury and manages all of the debt issuance of the federal government, how many people think in this room that when the government issues debt instruments, bonds, government bonds, Treasury bonds, that they're raising money that they can then spend? We won't actually accumulate anything. Anybody who put their hands up, and we now don't remember who put their hands up, anyone who put their hands up is victim of mythical thinking. You've been conned by the machine, the neoliberal machine, that's supported by the disgraceful profession that I happen to have devoted my life to. And let me tell you, I'll explain it later, the government raises taxes not to raise money. There is no taxpayer funds spent in Australia because the Australian government is the issuer of its own currency. And when the government issues bonds, you should think of bonds more as corporate welfare than raising money. Because think logically, why does a government that has its own currency, how does it need to raise money? Well, of course it doesn't. So there must be other reasons. We'll come back to it. Victor's already touched on it. Before 1945, the unemployment rate in Australia, you can't see you might be able to see this graph. The blue bit before, the red bit's before 1945. The unemployment rate jumped up and down according to the private cycle, spending cycle. Then the red bit comes along, that was the full employment era, where the government made a firm commitment under the 1945 White Paper to maintain full employment. If private spending wasn't sufficient to create enough jobs in the economy, the government was committed to making sure it filled that spending gap to make sure that those jobs didn't get lost. And unemployment rarely went above 2%. It did go above it once, Victor, but only once. And when it did go above 2%, it was in the 1961 credit squeeze, and in the election of that year, Robert Menzies nearly lost office. He won it on preferences in a Queensland seat, and if you don't know, the preferences were the Communist Party. And then after 1974 or 5, the blue line goes back up again. That's the modern era. And that was the era, as Victor said, the government started to abandon full employment. And that, the beginning of that era was not the Liberal coalition, it was the Whitlam government. Now, Victor hates me saying this, but it was the reason that we're all obsessed these days with fiscal surpluses, and you'll note that I never use the word budget when I'm referring to the government's fiscal affairs, because it's an inappropriate analogy with our own household budgets that is exploited to lead you all into thinking that you're paying the government taxes to spend. And it was the final budget of the fiscal statement of the Whitlam government that started to demonise the concept of fiscal deficits at the national government level. Now, prior to 1974, the federal government had run fiscal deficits almost always continuously. Almost always, about 88% of the years that we've got recorded data for, going right back to the 1930s. It always ran a continuous fiscal deficit of 1.5–2% of GDP, and there was a logical reason for that, and that is because the non-government sector was wanting to save some money. So if the income that they were earning was being saved and not spent, then what was going to happen the next period? There was going to be a spending gap unless someone else came in and spent. Well, there's only one other sector. If the non-government sector is trying to take some of their income out and store it away for risk, personal household risk management, there's only one other sector left. Yes, government sector. So we had to be in deficit for us to be in surplus. It's dollar for dollar. And if the government's in surplus, the non-government sector is in deficit dollar, the same amount, which means it's growing in indebtedness. I'll come back to that. And the other thing that was associated with those years of continuous fiscal deficits was that GDP growth was averaging much higher per year than it is now. And in that period, the red period, full employment period, GDP growth was, 4 or 5% sometimes, averaging well above 3.5–4%. Now it struggles to average 3%. And this is not just in Australia, this is around the advanced world. That the period before the neoliberal attack on fiscal deficits occurred, the period of true full employment all around the world, GDP growth was stronger. Equity was measured by inequality was lower. There was more upward mobility of workers from poor to better off. I grew up in a housing commission slum, but I had the welfare state that was keeping my working class parents able to keep me at school. That was the upward mobility. I despair at the thought of if the kids who grew up in the similar areas to where I grew up now, they've got no hope. And all the modern research tells you that the upward mobility now is virtually finished. Now, the full employment model was based upon the notion that the government was responsible under international treaties that Victor mentioned. There was also ILO treaties as well, where not only the right to work was established in the Declaration of Human Rights, but also in other treaties, the government assumed responsibility to maintain that full employment, maintain sufficient jobs. There were a number of different elements to that the government would make sure that there were enough jobs. If for short periods of time you were unemployed, there'd be adequate income support. And we used to define long-term unemployment as 12 weeks. Now it's 1 year, and there's a debate among statisticians that it should be now redefined as 2 years. The unemployment benefit was never meant to be a permanent income. It was only a temporary support because most people got jobs very quickly if they left a job or were sacked. There were also major institutions like wage-setting institutions in our economy which mediated what I call the class struggle to ensure that, which recognised that one employer who has the capital with lots of workers who want a job, who's got all the power? The one. And the tribunals recognised that, and they recognised that there had to be a countervailing power to ensure that everybody was on the train. We wanted the train to be moving faster, but we didn't want to leave an increasing number of people on the platform. And that was the role of these wage-setting institutions and income support-setting institutions. And in that era, the full employment era, our elected national government was a mediator in the class struggle. Now, what did we read most recently in Britain when the Labor Party performed disastrously in the national election? The next day, all these Labor heavyweights came out who were lobbying to become the next leader, came out and said, well, the problem is we're not pro-business enough. Well, the federal government during the full employment era was never pro-business. It was pro-wellbeing of everybody, a collective concept. And part of that was full employment. They knew that if you didn't have a job, you were stuffed. So that was the starting point of equity and well-being and of inclusion, of upward mobility, of income security. But it was also the starting point for strong GDP growth and strong income growth, strong profit growth. And that all came to tumbling down in the mid-70s when, there were, I won't go into it, it's too detailed, but there were major international ructions with the oil crises, the OPEC, formation of OPEC and the inflation that occurred when oil-dependent countries were facing rapid rise in price of oil. And for a long time my profession had been trying to chip away at the concept of full employment. In the 50s and 60s. They hated the Keynesian era. My profession is a very conservative, pro-business profession. And a lot of the employment theory that dominates now was really developed in the late 19th century and it was paid for by industrialists hiring economists to build a theory to offset the rising political and social instability associated with Marxism. Because Marx had shown categorically how unfair capitalism was, and they needed to work out a way to show it's fair and everybody gets what they put in, including capitalists. And all the textbooks now show that, and that was developed by economists who were paid for and by industrialists as bought, hired sort of guns. And so they've been simmering in the profession, but that spilled out into the political sphere when the OPEC oil crises occurred and the stagflation occurred in the mid-70s. And that gave the Conservatives the excuse to say, see, we told you so, full employment's bad. It gives workers too much power. It builds in what are called inflation biases to the economy. And that's when the full employment framework was abandoned. Okay, so what have we got here? So what are we going to... How much more time have I got?
6
minutes.
Okay, thank you. So what are we going to do about that? Well, the first thing we need to do, and see, this is all justified now by the government. You'll hear Hockey saying, we haven't got any money. Well, that's an outright lie. They issue the currency. They've got an infinite amount of money. So whenever a politician says, we haven't got any money, as a federal politician, they're lying. And so we've got to run budget surpluses to save up for the future. Well, why does the currency issuer have to save for the future when it issues the currency? That's a lie. And so what do we have to do about that? Well, we have to reframe the debate by building a better understanding of the way the macroeconomy works and the way the monetary system works. And that might sound like, bloody hell, he's an economist. Well, the reality is you've all got to become economists. Every single person in this room has to re-educate yourself. All those people who put their hands up, you're bought the con. You're part of the problem. And I'm not being personal, I'm just saying as a collective. You're a collective part of the problem because you're being exploited by liars to run policy regimes that are damaging to your own working class, for God's sake. So the first thing we have to do is reframe the debate. And the only way we can reframe the debate is if we re-educate ourselves and to learn how the monetary system works. And as I said, that might sound an arcane challenge. But unless you all become economists, you're going to be run over by economists. Unless you get a basic understanding of the way the monetary system works and the options available to currency issuers in the economy, you've got no hope of defending your rights because you've got a capitalist conspiracy out there, huge lobbying, think tanks with millions of dollars, pumping out bullshit all the time that convinces people like you, either directly or implicitly, to believe the things that you put your hand up to, which are outright. And so you've got to learn, we've all got to learn the opportunities that the government has and push that into the political process through the political networks that you operate in. Don't support any political party, never vote for the Labor Party at the moment. That might sound like a really hard thing for people who have rusted on Labor voters. Well, if you vote for the Labor Party, you're buying into the neoliberal myth. Sorry. And the point of all of this, and Victor mentioned it, is that unemployment's not a mystery. Unemployment is a choice that the government makes. The government could tomorrow eliminate all but frictional, people moving between jobs type unemployment. How would it do that? The Prime Minister could announce give a speech to the nation in an appropriate suit and an appropriate degree of gravitas, and announce that tomorrow we're changing all the Centrelink signage and we're going to call it the Job Guarantee Office. And all you workers who haven't got a job, who want to work, go down to the Job Guarantee Office. You know where it is because we've been punished by a vicarious and penurious machine called Centrelink and the job services industry. Go down there and get a job. We'll pay you the minimum wage and we'll lift the minimum wage to make sure it's a socially inclusive minimum wage. We'll also give you add-ons in the form of childcare, training allowances, superannuation, holiday pay, sick pay, and you'll have some decency restored to you by the job guarantee. And if workers didn't turn up next morning, well, you knew they wouldn't want to work. See, that's the ultimate work test. You don't need dole diaries, filling them out. You don't need to run workers through this ridiculous applying for however many jobs, and when there are not enough jobs anyway. The ultimate work test is to offer them a job. And if you want to find out more about the job guarantee, go to our website, Coffee's website. We've done extensive research. We've surveyed how many 140 local government agencies, asking them how many jobs could you create which would suit workers that are unskilled if the federal government paid for them. And we work, there's hundreds of thousands of jobs out there that would advance community need and advance environmental care services. The biggest growth in jobs are going to be, your questions later, the biggest number of jobs are going to be in personal care services as characters like me get too old. And 1 million. And, you know, this would help the home care sector. And so, basic points to finish. The Australian government can never run out of money. It's a choice that how much it spends. And if the non-government and if there's unemployment above about 1 or 2%, you know that the fiscal deficit is too low. Because you know that for the non-government sector savings levels, which is money coming out of the economy, you know, and not being re-spent into businesses around our regions, you know that the government spending to offset that isn't sufficient relative to its tax take. And what the other thing to note is that the government budget is not like our budgets. What's the big difference? Well, I've got to earn an income if I want to spend, or I've got to have good credit reference with the bank if I want to draw more than my income in certain periods of my life. Or I've got to sell assets if I want to raise money, or I've got to run down prior savings. In other words, I've got a financial constraint like all of us, because we don't issue the currency, we use the currency. But the currency issuer has none of those constraints. Now, I haven't got time, obviously, to go in to tell you why they tax or why they issue bonds, but you can read it. I've written probably millions of words over my career on that. But the point I wanted to probe when I asked those questions was to put an uncertainty into you and to put a motivation into the room to go and re-educate yourselves, to learn why it is that the government can't run out of money, to learn why the government can afford to have full employment, to learn how it might be possible, and to know why it's not the reality. It's got nothing to do with the resources the government's got at its disposal. It's political and ideological. Okay, so we're going to finish right there.
That's the halfway mark. The next half is for you. It's called Q&A, which we've heard a lot about recently. We believe in freedom of speech, so welcome to it. But Q means question. There's a bit of confusion about this. You can't believe this, but sometimes people stand up to have a question and it sort of morphs into a speech. So we have a bell keeper, and if she hears the question becoming a speech, she'll hear the bell go after about a minute. Okay? Now the other thing is, unfortunately today our mobile mic isn't working, so you can either put your hand up and shout a question or come up and speak into the mic. But it's now over to you, and you can speak about any of the things we brought up today, which are both the penalty rates and the broader stuff on unemployment and full employment. And there is a crossover on this, incidentally, because Professor Mitchell has done work on penalty rates for your union, Jane, I gather. So anything you like.